So let's take a focused look at the Primaris Land Speeder, why a Storm Speeder is looking quite so strong right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a Space Marine unit review, and for this one focusing on the Storm Speeders. In the video we'll talk briefly about their lore and models, go through each one of their datasheets and compare their damage output, talk through the best application of their buffing rules, and then go on to talk about some buff synergy and gameplay plans. I thought it could be interesting to cycle back to the Storm Speeders once again, given that they seem to be appearing in competitive lists in a few different formats now. A good chunk of more standard Ultramarines Gladius style ones often tend to be using Storm Speeder Hammerstrikes. You can see one in this post-update list here. And particularly for Divergent Chapters, the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike kind of went from good to great. Here's one in a pre-update Dark Angels list that placed very high at the London Grand Tournament. And plenty of them tend to get a look in as buffing units for the Death Watch as well, most often the Thunderstrike, though this pre-update undefeated list here decided to take both a Hammerstrike and Hailstrike instead. Basically after a fair chunk of 10th edition maybe being a kind of niche unit, they're seeming a lot more viable in multiple different formats. For core Codex Space Marines, taking a look at 25 top placing lists, Storm Speeder Hammerstrikes featured in 6 of them. Still certainly more of an option than an auto-include, but an option that's embraced by a really good number of players that actually do well with their armies. And then for the Divergent Chapters, it really is a story of some armies really liking them, some not so much. From a look at 15 top placing lists for each of the Divergent Chapters, 5 use them for the Dark Angels, mostly Thunderstrikes, though some Hammerstrikes, and quite a lot use the Land Speeder Vengeance as well. Though for Deathwatch armies that were doing well, they seem to be very popular indeed. 9 of the 15 lists over the last balance pass use at least one Storm Speeder, with most being Thunderstrikes, and given a big points buff to the unit, it's going to likely get far more prevalent for those 2 chapters, and maybe sneak into a few other Divergent chapter lists too. In the lore and background, the Storm Speeder is basically the Primaris take on the classic Land Speeder. That's been a staple of Warhammer 40K since the pretty early days really. I like a lot of things with recent Space Marine tech. It's a classic design that's had a bit of innovation and tinkering gone on under the guidance of Mr. Belisarius Core. This design innovating on Archon Land's anti-grav technology with Core's repulsor grav plates. Their role within a Space Marine army remains rather similar though, a 2-crewed fast-moving vehicle, hurtling across the battlefield propelled by some great big jet engines and able to dish out a heavy amount of firepower, supporting forces that advance and helping pick the enemy apart with lightning strikes. Land Speeder models have certainly changed and developed a good bit over the years. Older designs basically had the 2 crew more or less sitting on top of the Land Speeder. On the left there's a classic one and a Forge World reinterpretation of it. Then we have the long-serving plastic model that I remember fondly from the 3rd edition starter set of 40k, that one being expanded with options for Typhoon missiles and the Tornado pattern with extra guns, and now we've had the Primaris Storm Speeder on the top right, a pretty significantly bigger vehicle driven by a pair of Space Marines still, though still going with the fairly unsubtle Astartes flying brick kind of approach. The current models from early 9th edition, I feel like it was maybe one that was greeted with a bit more of a muted reception compared with certain Primaris releases, perhaps being a bit unusual to both have really quite a large chunky model that's also sort of light fast attack at the same time. With the amount of weapons that it has, it rarely gets priced too cheaply. I strongly suspect that the price doesn't really motivate people to add them to their collections too much. They're around £50, $80 or €64, and I strongly suspect that that's a contributing factor to why slightly fewer people have one in their collections. If you were looking to pick one up, of course, I'd certainly make sure that you do so at discount on such a big model. There's plenty of great discount stores out there. The ones that are linked down in the video description help to support Auspex Tactics and do save a good amount versus Games Workshop. There's plenty of ones around the world, including Wargame Portal in the USA and Taschengeldieb in Germany and the EU. As ever, a big thank you to anyone supporting via those. Let's get into taking a look at the datasheet though, and after the latest points updates bringing the price of the Thunderstrike down a bit, the 3 Storm Speeders now cost anywhere between 115 points and 135, so not exactly a small investment in a Space Marine army, and not so very many points off something like a big battle tank or fighty dreadnought. As you might expect of a more fast attack style model, they're of course much faster than most of those, though not really all that durable. They do have a 14-inch movement and the fly keyword, which would mean that they're going to be able to get the first strike on the opponents rather than the other way around. Usually I feel like that's a good argument for starting them on the board. They do have the option to deep strike and drop down from the skies. Perhaps depending on the context of the army list and what you're using it for, it could be alright, though given it's got really quite a big base and profile, you're not going to have too many sneaky spots to be able to put one. It's still perhaps going to be an option though for flexibility if you really don't think that you're going to be getting lines of sight on anything till turn 2. My default would still be to run them on the board though. For their defensive profile, they're not a pushover to take down. They do have really quite a big 11 wounds at toughness 9 with a 3+ save, and to me feel a lot more akin to a transport vehicle or light tank as opposed to a fast attack style vehicle. They are quite big and bulky. They're really not so enormously different to certain Space Marine tanks out there like Gladiators or Predator tanks. The main thing is just losing that extra bit of toughness, which means that things like strength 10 missiles or melter weapons, they'll wound them just that bit better. Basically, it's a defensive profile that's going to be fairly resilient against small arms, but the right profiles are going to go through them very, very fast indeed. If they are on the front line and maybe doing trading things over an objective, at least this forces the opponent to actually put something into them that has a bit of damage. Besides that, they have a tiny close combat weapon profile in melee, so if they desperately need to do damage in close combat for some reason, tank shot could be an option, and they're OC3. So a small presence on objectives, but basically any sort of infantry or multi-model squad is going to outcompete them most of the time. Going through the variants, and first up we have the Hailstrike. This one's the cheapest at 115 points, and for damage output you get 2 Fragstorm grenade launchers with D6 strength 4 shots each at 18 inches, an Onslaught Gatling cannon with its 8 shots and devastating wounds, and a twin Iron Hail heavy stubber, spitting out 6 shots at 18 inches, and probably deafening the Primaris Marine who's sitting between it. With a whole bunch of profiles that are AP 0 and damage 1, this one's just really not going to be any real use for targeting anything other than the lightest infantry. And even then it might not even necessarily clear out entire units worth of Horde squads. One Hailstrike does around about 8 Termagants worth of damage, or perhaps 1 or 2 Space Marines with all that volume fire. It's just not really something that Space Marines need loads of, so it really is down to the special rule to sell it. And after you've shot this one, you get to mark 1 unit that isn't a monster or vehicle, and the rest of your gun line gets a bonus AP -1 against that target. That rule definitely does have a fair bit of value of its own, and it's going to be very nice into any sort of elite infantry army list and give it a real purpose there. Things like Terminator equivalents, Adeptus Custodes, or Victrix Honor Guard at the moment will be easier to shoot down with that debuff on the go, but then will be really quite useless into armies that don't care, that just want to hide a fair bit, or are going to have a lot of monsters and vehicles where they're going to be the main things that are going to be taking damage. Overall, it does mean that this one's by far the most niche compared with the other two. I think mainly due to its damage output being quite so inflexible. It does mean that if the debuff doesn't matter in a big way in this detachment, then you would have been better off with just about anything else. Before we move on to the other two, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA, and their main offering is to have a huge range of dice out there for different wargaming factions, and really quite big fun, chunky and nicely made ones that have a good feel to them and roll well. Most of the different armies that you could want them for have multiple different designs on offer, and quite a lot of those have options where you have both squared corners or round corners for them. The usual way that they're sold tends to be around about $33 or £28 for 25 dice or so. They ship from the USA, so are far cheaper domestically there as opposed to across the world, and if you do wind up picking up anything from them, there's the code Auspex for a 5% discount, so that could make any order of them just that little bit cheaper. If you want to check out their vast range, there'll be links down in the video description below if you'd like to take a look. As well as their more standard offerings, they do have some fancy channel merch dice as well. There's a couple of different flavours of Auspex ones available, both a black set and a white set. Any purchases of those help to support the channel a little. In any case though, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. There'll be links down in the video description. Getting back to fast moving Space Marine vehicles though, and next up we have the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike. This one maybe feels like the one of the hour with its 10% points decrease. It dropped down from 150 points to a 135, which just dramatically improves it overall for damage and defense for the points cost. And I suspect that these are going to become very, very common, in particular for Deathwatch and Dark Angels, just due to how often they were played before. This thing does have some alright damage output just in its own right. You get one shot with some Storm Fury missiles, essentially with a las cannon profile that hits with a 2+, a las talon with a sort of strength 9 las cannon profile with 2 shots at 36 inches, again hitting on a 2+, and then an Icarus rocket pod hitting on a 3. Optimal targets for its guns might be things around the sort of toughness 8 to 9 and a big single model sort of profile. With a mix of profiles though, it will have at least some threat against most things. For its damage output at 18 inches, compared with the rest, it's the single best against gladiator targets or land raiders, at least going off base profiles with no other buffs on the go, and you might expect it to kill around about 2 normal Space Marines or about 1 Terminator per round of shooting. It's still not phenomenal damage, but definitely chips in a bit on its own right, and then hopefully makes up the rest of its value with its buffing rule. That buffing rule really is the main reason to take one, and usually why you just get the one in a Divergent Chapter army list, as after you've shot something, one thing that was hit by it gets a +1 to wound against it, provided that target was a vehicle or monster datasheet. Again, it is going to be a bit matchup specific. Not every single army out there has vehicles or monsters, or ones that are quite so meaningful and scary that you need the +1 to wound desperately, but really quite a lot of armies do, And in the context of certain Space Marine units, it can just make your army quite well rounded overall. If you've got lots of firepower that's kind of mid-strength and is pretty efficient into infantry and lighter targets already, they can make all of that mid-strength firepower just far more efficient into tough stuff too. Perhaps in particular, Plasma Fire gets on really well with this. Things like Hellblasters or the Redemptor Dreadnoughts Macroplasma Incinerator, having those wound things like Land Raiders on a 4+ is going to make them way more scary. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike definitely had a bit of a reallocation when they changed the Oath of Moment for the Space Marines though, and gave the Core Codex ones the boosted version. It means that you're rarely going to want this in a Core Codex Space Marine list, as you've got Oath of Moment on tap for when you need to focus down that big scary vehicle and get a +1 to wound on it, and that won't stack with this, and that's really quite a big driver behind why you see more Hammerstrikes there as opposed to Thunderstrikes. They're still not going to be completely useless, but on some turns they might potentially well be redundant, and that's not a great place for them to be in. Any of the Divergent Chapters can get some great value though. Dark Angels often tends to quite enjoy their Plasma Fire with Hellblasters potentially. Deathwatch certainly enjoy their Indomitor kill teams, and they get on great with these, and they're pretty efficient just paired with other anti-tank units as well. Ballistas Dreadnoughts might gain a fair bit, and while the percentage increase isn't quite so dramatic on Vindicators, it is buffing a unit that's already very efficient into its targets, and potentially having them reroll all hits with Oath of Moment, and then +1 to wound with this guy is going to lead to some very scary damage and Ds. It is a rule that has diminishing returns though, and that's often why you see one of them rather than multiple. Lastly, for the variants, we've got the Stormspeeder Hammerstrike. This one brings a whole bunch of Strength 9 firepower and kind of wants to be within 18-inch range for 2 of its guns. It gets Hammerstrike missiles with 2 shots at Strength 9 AP3 and damage D6 to 36 inches, a Melter Destroyer which is basically a 3-shot multi-melter to 18 inches, and then 2 Crackstorm grenade launchers, each with a single Strength 9 damage D3 shots to 18 inches as well. Those profiles are going to make it pretty excellent against things like toughness 8 or 9 vehicles and monsters in general. It'll be solid against heavy infantry, though it really likes boosted oath to help it out against tough stuff. For putting that in the damage comparison, here's how the numbers for Warhammer Strike stacks up, doing a bit better against the Intercessors and the Terminators, though not by all that much, and being a little behind the Thunderstrike into the tougher tanks due to not having that strength 12 shot. Bear in mind it does cost a little bit less than the Thunderstrike though. For this one in particular though, you can get 2 very big buffs for it against the toughest targets if you can get within 9 inches to be in melter range with that great big melter weapon. That's going to significantly increase the damage output of that, and as mentioned, if you can put boosted Oath of Moment on its target, then its damage output gets pretty high indeed. If say you were using it as a trading unit at the front of the army, you could potentially have it zoom out 14 inches, get within melter range of say an enemy gladiator or predator tank or something, and have a pretty reasonable chance to do something like 11 wounds to it. Obviously very swingy indeed depending on how the rolls go, and particularly the d6 damage, but there's at least some chance that it might well make its points back in one volley and one round an enemy similar vehicle. It's got pretty respectable numbers into things like enemy Land Raiders as well. Of course the others will also get better with boosted Oath of Moment as well, but with a +1 to wound against tough targets and the melter rule, this thing's going to have a pretty significant advantage. Then also the second part of its rule is genuinely also interesting if you're trying to focus down a target. It basically strips cover from a unit, and in quite a lot of situations that's going to be similar value to the Hammerstrike. Cover's quite easy to get in 10th edition, and a lot of the time enemy units are going to get it, and it does have the advantage that it's at least usable both against infantry and against monsters and vehicles, so following up with other firepower on the same target is going to be pretty brutal, particularly if you've also thrown Oath of Moment into it. With this paired with another ranged damage dealer, you're going to have some pretty serious effects on one target. For unit support buffs and synergy for these things, as we've seen, Oath of Moment is really quite a big deal to these units, pretty much determining which ones you play and really helping the Hammerstrike punch up. In general, beyond that though, they feel like the sort of units that you're not generally going to want to put loads of buffs and synergies on, and more have these supporting other units in your army as opposed to the other way around. For generic stratagem options, I guess if you're deep striking you could potentially rapid ingress them. That could be one way to get the Stormspeeder Hammerstrike in melter range if you thought it was going to be a really big deal. I feel like more often than not with a 14-inch movement and maybe the option to advance and shoot in certain detachments, that's probably going to be more powerful though. I briefly mentioned tank shot could be used earlier. It does mean that you could generate a few extra mortal wounds in the charge phase if you really needed to finish something off. If say there was an enemy unit on 2 wounds or so left, and that was the only way to destroy it, then that could well be a good deal before they strike back. And as with most Space Marine units, Armour of Contempt could be useful enough for survival. Probably a little bit on the situational side on these guys though, compared with some of your most valuable units. But if the opponent's undercommitted to killing one and it's going to tip the balance, could well be worth a command point to spend. The firepower could also be amped up by all the other Space Marine shooting things that are normally going around, potentially incursors to help out the Hammerstrike, Combi Lieutenant rerolls maybe, or I guess even other Storm Speeders if you're using them in tandem. For chapters and detachments, the Codex detachments have got quite a lot going for these guys. They're quite often used in Ultramarines Gladius as we saw earlier. They'll enjoy the option with the Devastator Doctrine to advance and shoot there, and particularly the Hammerstrike to get within range. Maybe in the right situation you could use Storm of Fire to buff their own shooting, perhaps in particular against a super high save target like some Victrix guarding cover using Oath of Moment or something, but there might well be better targets with it. With that strength 9 firepower, the Hammerstrike also appreciates Guilliman's double Oath of Moment. If there's a bit more of that going around, there might be more chance that you can justify it to just nuke its target with Melter. They can also be interesting in Stormlance though. That one's got the -1 to hit and wounds debuff against enemy shooting, which is quite often going to be significantly better than Armour of Contempt against certain enemy fire. It's basically a plus 80% durability boost if the opponent was hitting and wounding on a 3+. Not bad that it lasts for the entire phase as well. The Ironstorm Spearhead's always going to be interesting for vehicle armies. They'll enjoy the single rerolls. There's plenty of good vehicle stratagems that might be useful in a pinch, and Ironstorm's likely to be building the firepower gun lines that these guys are going to be in a good place to help support. And then finally for main ones I wanted to focus on the Firestorm and Forgefather's detachment. Again, feels like it could be useful enough for the Hammerstrike. You've got the assault keyword there to be able to get it in range, and then strength 10 with melter weapons at close range is a pretty big buff as well. You could even pair it with Vulcan's reroll to wounds as well if it made sense, though beyond that feels like a few Salamander's armies aren't going to care quite so much about the stripping cover effect that it has. Flamers already won't care about that, and Melter is AP4 anyway. Others could find various ones useful though. With Anvil Siege Force you could stack a bunch of damage buffs, and Vanguard Task Force could make them harder to shoot down as they support some on the ground infantry. You could have some Centurions, Eradicators or Inceptors work pretty well there. For the Divergent Chapters, at least so far for most competitive lists, it tends to be mainly Dark Angels and Deathwatch. If you are going with one of the others, the Thunderstrike or maybe Hammerstrike could be very interesting still. It'd just need to be an army list that's got a fairly significant amount of firepower to back it up, maybe 2 or 3 gun tanks that take the boosts particularly well, maybe a pair of Ballistas Dreadnoughts or Vindicators or something similar. For the Dark Angels, they might have some Hellblasters on the go. Some like to use them with Azrael, and particularly with access to Wrath of the Rock and the +2 to strength stratagem that they can get. You might even be able to wound things like toughness 10 vehicles on a 3+ with Hellblasters there. The Raven Wing keyword gets applied to the Storm Speeders, and that might allow a few stratagem accesses in various different detachments. Company of Hunters gets advance and shoot all the time, and several lock stratagems to the Raven Wing keyword. And just elsewhere in the army there's plenty of other plasma fire as well. The Land Speeder Vengeance is another reasonable enough one, and particularly with Raven Wing Black Knights dropping down to 80 points, boosting their plasma fire to make that yet more dangerous is going to be another really big deal. Then finally for Deathwatch, I'd mainly be about supporting the Indomitor kill team, though plenty of the others have some interesting enough firepower as well. Theirs really does seem pretty perfect though. Lots of medium strength attacks from their bolt rifles, flamers, and big melter weapons. I absolutely love the buff of the Thunderstrike into the hardest targets around. It was interesting to see that Deathwatch list with both the Hammerstrike and Hailstrike on the other hand. If you think that the meta is going to be high save infantry like Victrix Honor Guard, or Terminators with Armour of Contempt on the go, that could be pretty interesting. In any case, they're looking like a pretty interesting option for the Space Marines right now. For perhaps some of the most obvious options that most armies are using, 1 or 2 Hammerstrikes and core Codex Space Marine armies, and often paired with some other GOM tanks to buff, maybe some Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Vindicators, and then usually just the 1 Thunderstrike for either Deathwatch or Dark Angels. I say they particularly win out given the points cost, though Hammerstrikes are usable enough too as well. Well, they've got loads of options to support them. I'd usually keep support kinda minimal. Pairing a Hammerstrike with Oath of Moment in core Codex Space Marines feels like one of the single most dramatic things to really change their battlefield role. Otherwise it might be just slightly situational damage and defense stratagems to help them win positional fights, where the opponents may be trying to destroy them without exposing too much. Then for their use in game, while you can deep strike them, I typically default to keeping them on the board. They would absolutely need to have a good place to hide from alpha strikes though, as they need to be hitting the enemy first and not the other way around. With their good movements, maybe setting up behind a ruin on the flank somewhere could be a pretty reasonable place. As with a 14-inch move, they're still going to be able to bring their presence to bear when they need to. If the Thunderstrike's buff is going to be a really powerful one this game, with its good range on its las weapons, you could afford to keep it a bit further back and just nose into lines of sight to light up its targets for the things that you really want to buff, and then potentially be a bit more bold with it in the late game, using its good movement to bring it into the mid-board and gain lines of sight. For the Hammerstrikes, they probably want to be a bit further forward than that, again with good movement and maybe advance and shoot to jump into melter range and maybe just destroy something that your opponent might not expect to die to its melter. Maybe if it's able to do that while debuffing one enemy unit to light them up and strip cover for them from other gun line things, then so much the better. In any case, let me know what you make of these Storm Speeders down in the comments below. Do you own the models? Have you been using them in 10th edition? If so, or would you be tempted to add one to your army list? In any case, that's just about it for this one. Feel free to check out the video sponsor Baron of Dice, there'll be links down in the video description. As mentioned, they've got a vast amount of different dice designs, ones that could work for just about every faction out there. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. That one's linked down in the video description. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.